want to speak a little bit about this research that we have done. And this research is about impact investing. And I'm deliberately not using any slides because I think it might be better if I can try to convey it with my words and also make breaks in between. So the research that we're doing is on impact investing. You probably heard impact investing before. It is an idea that we are using the financial means but in a sustainable way. So not just grant giving, but we're using financial means to improve the life of people and also to save the planet. So basically, in a way, make use of the things that we have and apply them to do good. So when we think about impact investing, it involves typically more than two parties, but at least two parties. It involves the investor. That could be banks, it could be funds, it could be foundations, but it also includes, of course, the investees. And investees are actually the quite important party because they are the ones want to speak a little bit about this research that we have done. And this research is about impact investing. And I'm deliberately not using any slides because I think it might be better if I can try to convey it with my words and also make breaks in between. So the research that we're doing is on impact investing. You probably heard impact investing before. It is an idea that we are using the financial means but in a sustainable way. So not just grant giving, but we're using financial means to improve the life of people and also to save the planet. So basically, in a way, make use of the things that we have and apply them to do good. So when we think about impact investing, it involves typically more than two parties, but at least two parties. It involves the investor. That could be banks, it could be funds, it could be foundations, but it also includes, of course, the investees. And investees are actually the quite important party because they are the ones knowing what to do on the ground. They might come up with a new clean tech innovation. They might come up with a societal innovation that would, for example, help female children in Africa to get a better education. So they are the ones on the ground who have the knowledge and will basically try to achieve something from the invested money. Now, this still falls very, very short because these two are negotiating about the financial aspects, about so what should be the return for the investment, but also, and even more importantly to my understanding, what would be the desired positive societal and environmental impacts that they try to achieve. And let me be very clear at this point that we're not talking about sustainability accounting. We're not talking about all these sort of SASB and metrics where you actually have an ESG rating. It's not about the negative things that you do with your company. In impact investing, it's all about the positive things. So in other ways, what is the positive impact that you have on the life of the people, on the planet, on the environment that you might have? So what is this sort of positive impact that you have? And these two parties now negotiate. But if we think it through, it's actually wrong what they do, because the most important party and the most important people to think of in such an impact investing would be the beneficiaries, those who we are doing it for. So it's not so much about what the one party promises and the other one demands, but it's what this good means for the beneficiaries on the ground that would be targeted by the impact investing. So this can get highly complex because now we have not only investors, investees, we have the beneficiaries, but in many, many cases, we have further involvement by non-profit organizations as intermediaries, but also by the public sector, because in many cases, there is some sort of grant giving or subsidiaries or some sort of collaterals being done by the public sector. So we have highly complex settings. And now in these negotiations about the impact investings, one of the biggest questions that people have to ask themselves is, now what are we going to measure? And it's pretty easy to agree on how to measure financial returns. Everyone knows how that can be done, and it's quite standardized. But how can we measure short and long-term social and environmental impacts? And even more so, how can we measure the risks that might come with that at the same time? So in this setting, there is one important term, and that important term is materiality. Materiality denominates what is deeply relevant for all stakeholders. So basically something that is, if we don't measure that, if there is a change in this sort of thing, that would really have an impact on what we are doing. So materiality denominates the deep relevance. So of course, materiality could be used as a guidance in our negotiations on the measures of impact investings. But unfortunately, materiality has a very long tradition in the traditional finance sector. So over hundreds of years now, auditors have negotiated what and how would we come and define what is material and what is not material. But outside the financial sphere, especially when it comes to societal impact, when it comes to environmental impact, this materiality definition is actually not standardized. It's not even accepted in a general way. So you might find 2 or 3 or 4 parties, and they might all have a different concept of what is material, of what is relevant. Now, can you imagine how difficult it must be? So you have investors who want to invest money for good. You have entrepreneurs on the ground who know what they do and who have a mission to improve the environment or the social life of people. And you have the beneficiaries, but they cannot agree on what to measure because it's so idiosyncratic. It's so difficult to agree on that. So our research, and if I say our research, we stand together with my wonderful colleague, Alex Nichols from the University of Oxford. And we two together with my doctoral student, Sarah, we have done quite some research. And our questions were, first of all, so what is the nature and what is the source of these contestations around materiality? In other words, what is the whatness of the problems behind that no one can agree on materiality in terms of environmental relevance, in terms of societal relevance? And the second question we asked ourselves was then, now knowing the nature, or assuming that we at some point in time know the nature of this contestation, how can it be overcome? In other words, how can we deal with that contestation? Because the ultimate outcome and the ultimate aim of not only the research, but of impact investing is to improve the lives of people, is to improve the condition of our planet. So what we do for us is highly relevant, because then if we enable better impact investings, we basically enable better outcomes. So what we did was a very large-scale global study. We used 19 cases among Bill and Melinda Gates foundations, huge banks, intermediaries around the globe. And I can't even count how many interviews we did, but we ended up with roughly 150 documents, interviews, secondary documents, documentations and reports of impact investings on the ground, feedback loops from the beneficiaries. And our findings were that there are 3 major arenas of contestation. In other words, there are 3 major sources why materiality in terms of societal and environmental relevance is contested. And the first one is something that is it seems pretty clear there's a huge power imbalance between the investors and the investees. And what is more, we even found cases that some investors, like large banks, they were not talking about the investees, meaning the entrepreneurs, as people or as some clever people that are inspired by what they're doing. No, can you imagine? They were talking about them as assets. So they completely objectified the investees, the ventures on the ground, because for them it was something that they invest in, and they wanted to treat them like every other asset they would invest in. So the power imbalance was a huge problem. And this power imbalance brought, for example, demands that the investees would need to measure things that they actually didn't want to measure because they didn't find it relevant for what they were doing. The second was based on the norms and standards and different logics. If you imagine a bank or a fund that would invest, would be a very commercial, would have a commercial logic. And a commercial logic typically brings with a very quantitative approach to things. So nothing that can be measured in terms of numbers, it's not existing. Versus the theory of change, something that the entrepreneurs would tell how they're doing would improve the lives of the people, that is more a qualitative narrative approach. So you have a conflict between these two different logics. And finally, the third arena of contestation was that there is sometimes stakeholders in this whole thing with a very different motivation concerning the status quo of society. And for example, we saw that in some cases, the investors wanted to make incremental change. They wanted to improve the lives of the people, whereas the ventures or the entrepreneurs actually wanted to have some more radical. They wanted to change the whole system. So there was a huge problem when you have these different motivation towards the status quo. Now, one thing became clear to us. These contestations are definitely hard to overcome. How can you overcome such deeply rooted problems? But then we had an idea and we talked to Amartya Sen, which is, you probably know him. He's a Nobel Prize winner in 1998. He won the Economic Nobel Prize. He was working on inequality and looking at how the resources in the community shall be divided and can be divided. And he's also well known because Amartya Sen in 2009 basically influenced the development of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So this person really had quite an influence over the last few years, and he is known for extending Rawls' theory of justice. So Amartya Sen is very much famous for coming up with fairness and justice, but in a sort of expanded way of what Rawls was building the foundation for. So our idea was, how can we overcome these contestations by making use of this new philosophy of Amartya Sen, of his Senian justice. And the idea was, and I want to just pick out two things, because then we're getting into the philosophy. Now, the first thing is that Sen suggests that when we basically transfer the problem of materiality to the problem of a societal arrangement, which it is. So if we agree on materiality, we would come to a societal arrangement. And then we have to ask, now, if it is a societal arrangement, it is good for whom? And the common agreement would be for the beneficiaries, because everyone in this sort of setting would agree it has to be good for the beneficiaries. But the question is then how to judge and compare the different ways of societal arrangements. Now, the first thinking of Sen brings with that he said, rather than assuming that there is a perfect agreement on materiality, ab initio, from the very beginning, as Rawls would suggest, rather than doing that, we should look at a process perspective and say that we accept the inequalities during the process, and we rather focus on the realized outcomes. So basically we do, and we look at what can we realize, what would be the realized outcomes, and accept the potential injustice along the way. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to overcome these, but it's much better to start the ball rolling, to go along, and then adapt if it's necessary. Now, this is a very interesting perspective, because if we look at this process perspective towards realized outcomes, what it means is that we need someone to be an impartial spectator. Now, here comes the thing. Rawls had this wheel of ignorance. You just brought it, Julia, just I think 10 minutes ago, this wheel of ignorance. But that wheel of ignorance, that would apply only within a focal group, let's say all the nations in the world. But what if there is more voices, more people, more interest parties outside this focal group that we're talking about? So what, for example, we would need to bring in the voices of something or someone who is not a nation, who might be outside the whole thing, because it might not, like some people living who are outside traditional nations or traditional focal groups. So Sen brings in the idea of a judgment by a so-called open impartiality. And this open impartiality says that we as a society need to be ready to include the voices of the many. So rather than just talking about individual people comparing versus Rawls' wheel of ignorance, he said that, no, let's hear the voices of the many and do a reasoning with a necessary transparency and accountability. Now, in impact investing, for example, these impartial spectators could be the intermediaries. Like there is non-profit organizations who specialize in being intermediaries for such impact investings. And they could also act as process observers and therefore reduce the power imbalances. So one of the big contestation would be solved. And the second one is when now finally we would have different realized outcomes, how can we compare them? And that's another and a very important thing, because it drives forward our society, I believe, because Sen suggests not to use the traditional welfare measurements and not to use GDP or an income, because if we think it through, any income can just be seen as a transfer. And a transfer itself is inherently unjust. Just think for a second that everyone in the United States would get a bike as a transfer. Now that would be inherently unjust, because think about, you would be handicapped and you couldn't even use the bike. So what good would it do for you? But in terms of GDP or in terms of income, you could say, oh no, we are very fair, we are very just, we distribute it even. Yeah? So these measurements might not work. So Sen comes up with something revolutionary. Sen says, how can we measure realized outcomes? We can measure it in terms of the achieved capabilities and functionings. And these two terms, capability and functionings, basically denominate the opportunities and with that the possible life choices that the people have. So measuring if my doing would increase the opportunities for a person in terms of the possible life choices that this person has, does many things at once. First of all, it acknowledges diversities, because these opportunities are very individualistic. These opportunities are basically what my opportunities and life choices would be, maybe different to those of another person. So we can say that impact investing should maximize the opportunities for the individuals, for the beneficiaries out there. That is something that everyone can agree on. And it's Also, it goes away from these traditional measurements like income or GDP. And what it also means is that rather than standardizing impact measurement, which is currently all the hype, so we have to standardize ESG, we have to standardize this, we have to force everyone to use that. But basically, this is inherently unjust, because what we need is a context-specific measure, and that context-specific measure, because it has to include the capabilities, needs to be driven bottom-up by the beneficiaries. And then, of course, negotiated with impartial spectators to make sure that there is no power imbalance. So in our research, we were for the first time bridging a more financial-oriented and accounting-oriented problem in impact investing with a very modern approach of Senian social justice. And the outcome is not just that we have enhanced the theory with that, but a very practical outcome, that we could actually show ways forward how to make impact investing for a better planet, for a better life for people, more efficient and work better.